Hello, it is a Tuesday, which means it's time for another in real life video. Sorry. As you can see, we're in a bit of a new setting. I've kind of perhaps moved, right? We aren't like the homeowners here, but we are renting, but a little bit more expensive. But the bright side is a lot closer to family and friends to some extent. Well, to a significant extent, actually, which is pretty all right by me. That works pretty well with what I do, actually, since, you know, doesn't matter really where I work from, right? I'm pretty flexible when it comes to that. So, hey, there was an opening. We kind of seized it. Here we are. As you can see as well, behind me, could use maybe some work with lighting. I think the lighting on me is actually pretty decent, but the background, it's completely blown out, so I don't know what to do about that. And of course, we're still very much in the process of like unpacking and moving stuff around, so apologies for whatever is back there. A bit of a disaster zone, and probably will be for maybe a couple months. I would say 1 month, but it is the holidays, so what can you do? But regardless, thank you so much and all of that, of course, for watching, liking, subscribing, sending donations in whatever form you do, because, hey, it's stuff like that that makes this kind of thing possible, right? Anyway, nonetheless, let's get to the topic at hand, which is a general viewer submitted question. And, of course, as always, if you too have a general viewer submitted question that you would like to, well, a question that you would like to make submitted, feel free to do that in the comments. Helps me a ton if you include a question mark for when I add it to my ever-growing list. But this week's comes to us from, let me see here. Let's see. A general viewer whose username should be, of course, somewhere in the bottom third of the screen right about now. And they ask, what are your favorite / best boss fights in the Elder Scrolls? Also non-final bosses. Which is a pretty interesting question, right? I would not be one to say that like the combat in Elder Scrolls games is exactly the draw, right? At least for me. I can really only speak on a personal level, and that I would say that like combat is serviceable, right? It's fun. There's some reactive stuff going on, but it's not exactly the main mechanic that's drawing you to the game. It's not like Elden Ring or something like that. It's the sandbox experience, right? It's being able to go out and explore and see the world react to you in different ways and to live another life, as it were. But that, of course, has a major impact on bosses and like what are fun and enjoyable bosses. It's tough to nail down because a lot of them are a little, the mechanics of the fight are a little uninteresting, a little not terribly cool, right? There's not much in the way of like, oh, you have to jump from this platform to the other, you have to stand behind a rock to get rid of a blast, you gotta run away at this point or whatever point, right? A lot of them aren't that terribly wild, right? Maybe one of the more wild ones is during the fight with Alduin or Alduin, whichever you prefer. Don't you have to use the Clear Sky Shout to clear some of the fog up? Maybe. You definitely have to use Dragon Rend. That, I guess that's a little interesting, but that's not exactly like terribly involved, right? A lot of what's interesting about, sorry as well if you can hear the love dog just like snoring up a storm very nearby. Maybe got picked up on the mic, but apologies. Nonetheless, I don't know immediately what would be, all right, here we go. One of my favorite, like, final boss fights, I would say, and now mind you, like I said, this is ignoring sort of like the story build-up, like who is an interesting villain, right? We have answered that before in the past, I believe. who like my favorite villain or villainous group would be. But this is just purely on like an encounter on a mechanical level, right? Like, for instance, you go through the fog wall, and then you have a big health bar appear, and you gotta fight him, right? Obviously, that doesn't necessarily happen here in Elder Scrolls Land, but bear with me. I would say, true enough, there are more interesting fights, like, leading up to it, right? Like, although the actual fight with Alduin is a little lackluster, the sort of vibe, the presence is very cool, right? You're in this different, unfamiliar place, so you get to see all these new, different sights. There's peculiar characters there. The music is very different from what you've been hearing. It's got its own, like, little soundtrack there. It's very neat, very cool. If you're getting into the story, as it were, you know, it feels kind of like a very cool moment. But the fight itself, maybe not so much. Not as cracked up as you would think it would be. However, I would say one of the more interesting, on a mechanical level, fights in Elder Scrolls world would maybe be, and mind you, this is barring Elder Scrolls Online, which of course is an MMORPG which has, like, you know, dungeons and raids and stuff like that, which would actually, I would think, fulfill the sort of desire to have a mechanically interesting fight, right? I would guarantee you, alright, I wouldn't guarantee you, but I would bet that would mean, like, there are fights in that game that have interesting mechanics, right? But once again, we're purely going off of my own experience, and I'm not terribly well versed in ESO, unfortunately. But as far as the core games are concerned, I would say Hircine from the Blood Moon expansion for Morrowind. Of course, you get sort of like this build-up, right? And Hircine is kind of teased throughout the expansion, right? Which I think is fun and enjoyable for a villain. But like I said, that's more into like the world building, like the character behind the villain, you know, a lot of we've talked about before. But when push comes to shove and you go to the final area, you have to navigate, you have to go through a lot of, like, I don't know, if we're talking in MMORPG terms, you have to go through a lot of trash mobs, and it's quite a harrowing experience. Before you go to fight Hircine, I guess spoilers here for a Blood Moon, you fight Kurstag, right? Of Skyrim fame, but before that was present on Solstheim in the Blood Moon expansion, who is a pretty decent fight, but you can kind of get around it in some tricky ways, as you can with a lot of Morrowind fights and all of that. I guess the thing that makes the Hircine fight interesting is that it takes place immediately after Kurstag, and which is immediately after you navigating this, like, ice labyrinth, which full of pretty difficult enemies, a bunch of werewolves, among other things. And then finally at the end of it, and you don't have access to any other equipment and stuff, so you kind of have to prepare ahead of time, right? Like, okay, I'm going to opt into this mission. I'm going in here. I need to make sure I have X or Y potions that I need for my character. If I'm, like, going super enchantment heavy, am I prepared to, like, rest or wait in this place in order to get my enchantment charges up higher? Do I have enough, like I said, magica potions, fatigue potions, health potions, of course? Or also, more importantly, as we had done in Volume 1 of Morrowind Mondays, repair hammers. That was a huge issue for us because the enemies in there both took so much damage because they kind of scale, not infinitely, but they may as well have. They scaled very well with player level. And so they were both dealing tons of damage and taking tons of damage. And throughout all of that, my equipment was, like, on its last legs because I really, I had never actually gone through with the Tribunal final boss fight. Like, I knew of it, I had read of it before, but I'd never gone through with it. And it was pretty dang tough, right? Sort of undergoing the war of attrition. So by the time I'm arriving at the Hircine fight that I've heard so much about, I'm kind of like in this debilitated state, right? But even barring all that, if you go in fully prepared and whatnot, which I do like the idea of preparing for it, the more interesting part of it is the way in which you can choose what aspect of her scene you would like to fight. And I believe that impacts what you get at the end of the fight, like your reward, which I think is maybe a little unfortunate. Right? It kind of necessitates you looking up, like, okay, what's the reward? What reward is going to be ideally suited for my character or whatever from here. I feel like that could do with, like, I don't know, better planning, or have the reward not tied to which form, which, like, aspect of her scene you go up against. But yeah, the sheer fact that it's this boss fight wherein you kind of opt into which version you want to fight. You can fight her scene as, like, a bear, I think a wolf, and then her scene as, like, the humanoid form, which I thought was pretty neat at the time, right? And like I said, there's other stuff too, but a lot of it is just the build-up and, like, the intrigue and the interest of fighting the enemy, right? Like, I guess you could say Morrowind's core game fight, there's some interest in there because you have to go and run over to the heart and you have to hit that a few times. But that in and of itself, I don't know. That's cool on a, like, prophetic world building level, but in practice, it's not that wild, right? You can literally, like, fly around and jump around like nobody's business. It's not that wild. The final boss fight of Oblivion, not that wild because you don't really do it yourself. That is all Martin Septim. The final boss fight of Shivering Isles it's kind of cool, right? It's kind of cool. I can't remember. Do you need to interact with any of the, like, what do you call them? Order pylons or whatever they're called? The, like, shards of order? I can't remember if you need to do that. We talked about the Alduin one. Like I said, a lot of cool build-up, a lot of cool presence and all of that, but when push comes to shove, it's just not terribly interesting. Definitely the same goes for fighting, what's his name? Harkon at Castle Volkswagen at the end. Kind of just a very bog standard fight. He teleports around a bit, but really cool setting, a lot of cool build-up leading up to fighting this dude, but otherwise not that wild. The actual mechanics of the fight, you're not, like, having to look up at the sun and shoot at it or whatever in the middle of the fight. That would be a cool requirement to have, right? Especially if you guarantee that every player always has access to this specific item, or in some way Serrano could have been involved because, this is the trouble with these games. They're so open-ended. You don't know what your player has access to at this point in time. Therefore, it's hard to build mechanically an encounter around them having certain tools, because that's how you create interest in the combat encounters. You're like, okay, I always know the player can do a dodge roll. I always know the player can deal an attack. I always know the player can jump. Stuff like that. Right? That's why a lot of games that people particularly praise as having really good combat mechanics, they have defined tools in the player's tool set that the player always has. Thus, you can always build a combat encounter around the idea, okay, by this point we have expected that our player will have some degree of mastery over their tool set, A lot of my favorite combat-focused games, like Sekiro, like Doom Eternal, or Doom 2016, but really Doom Eternal, I really, really enjoyed on a mechanical level, sort of lean into this, right? They lean into the idea that, like, oh yeah, at this point, our player character, we know they can divert lightning if they perform this special move, right? We know that they can do a jump and an air dash, they can do a double jump. We know that they have access to that. It's very fun, very enjoyable. With a more sandboxy open world sort of game, like Elder Scrolls, you just can't fall back on that kind of thing. Once again, like Mirak, another great example, a lot of cool build-up, really cool set pieces and stuff leading up to the battle. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, once again, the failure is kind of derived from the idea that, like, you've given your player so many tools that you don't know what tools your player even has at that point, that's kind of like the interesting exception with the main quest of Skyrim is like, you know that the player has access to Clear Skies. You know that they have access to Dragonrend because that was like requisite material in the rest of the game, you know? The cooler way to go about it, and the frankly much harder way to go about it, is to make it to where you acknowledge like, yeah, we've created all these different vectors for which the player could have built out their character, and we are going to make the player feel very cool about having done this by virtue of like, okay, you're a thief character, therefore during this final boss fight, we're going to make it to where like there's a way in which you can get through it by sneaking, right? Or if you're like a character that specializes in using like sword and board, make it to where, you know, wielding a shield in some way, you can deflect an attack in an interesting way. Or like if you're a wizard, you have some sort of answer in that sense, you know? There's a lot of ways you can go around doing that. And a lot of action RPGs, not so much sandbox RPGs, but action RPGs that sort of focus on mechanical encounters and stuff do totally have setup for that. They have interesting ways in which you can like show off how you have developed the mechanics of your character, right? But once again, like I said, that's not really in the purview of these games, right? More so the sandbox open world experience. Live another life, like I said. So, also was asked in this question, was my favorite non-final boss. Which for me is probably... We have to go back to Morrowind again, undoubtedly. Because there's some very interesting ones there. The two that immediately spring to mind are both from the Tribunal expansion, which I quite enjoyed. Which also another classic case of an Elder Scrolls boss, wherein the boss fight at the end of the Tribunal expansion, very cool place that you're at. Lot of cool world building and story stuff going on involved in all that. A lot of cool stuff leading up to it, but the fight itself, however, non-story critical bosses in Tribunal. What's his name? Was it Gaynor? The wood elf who shows up and asks for money, and then no matter what happens, it's always meant to be this like horrifying yet comical string of events wherein eventually either you deny giving this character like X amount of gold, which continually keeps going up and up and up. Either you deny them because you've just had enough, you're just playing as like an a-hole, or what the character asks for just becomes so impossibly high. And even if you do have that impossibly high amount, the character still gets mad at you. Gaynor still gets pissed and then leaves and like swears vengeance upon you and does show up. Previously, you know, this is like one of the more, I feel like, iconic touchstones of that expansion that a lot of people who've never even played Morrowind will know of this. Originally, this character is showing up in like regular common clothing, and then following them swearing vengeance upon you, show up like decked out in damn near like endgame gear, right? Like a full suit of ebony armor, and like powerful weapons, stats maxed out, I think, or close to it, and is thus like a significantly more powerful character, and fights you, right? And hopefully by that time in the expansion, you're able to take them on or able to avoid them until you're ready to do it. But that's kind of a fun surprise the first time that happens. But for me, that is probably not the one that takes the cake. For me, it is, in true BGS fashion, one that is infamously bugged. That being the super secret, hidden, optional boss fight within the Tribunal expansion, the Lich, I think it's just Lich, not like Archlich or anything, Gedna Revel, or Relvel, I forget which one. But this is, she's like an undead Lich, right, who by default has pretty good stats, right, is a fairly decent challenge. However, the bug comes into play wherein we mentioned this before with regards to like the werewolves I was talking about at the end of Blood Moon. Getting a Relvel, even in like a regular version of Morrowind, I think without any sort of like bug fixing is just straight up super duper bugged and scales extremely highly and like exponentially with your player level and maybe endlessly. So like if you use one of those exploits where you just keep leveling endlessly, getting a Relvel will also keep like scaling upward more and more exponentially. And it is quite terrifying to fight this bugged version because, like I said, already baseline, working as intended, I suppose, already a difficult encounter. But you reach a point where fighting this Lich, obviously the way spells work, a spell is only going to do a certain amount of damage. There's no way to like scale up the damage that a spell effect is going to deal without like first applying like, oh, you're weak to fire damage, you're weak to frost damage, something like that. You're weak to magicka damage. The only other way is to like build out a spell itself that is just stronger. So obviously, when this creature is casting spells at you, you're probably the safest. Which, like I said, still, even in saying that, the spells are quite potent and powerful. The real trouble is when this character runs out of magicka and starts like melee attacking you, because their strength will have scaled up exceptionally high. Just as you, the player, can like abuse this mechanic by way of, you know, just like getting a ton of enchantments or just carrying around a ton of alcohol. It all keeps stacking up higher and higher, or using like the infamous Corpus bug or whatever. But it just keeps stacking your strength higher and higher to where you can one-shot pretty much anything. So too is the case with this character. And it becomes a point where you need to have, and this was like the only way I was able to clear her on my character. I can't remember if you can like levitate or jump or anything in that area. I think that would be a bit of an easier way to do it if there was room to levitate, right? I think maybe that would make it a lot more doable. But my character, first time through, definitely wanted to try and do it melee mode. So had to stack a lot of sanctuary effects, which are ones that make it to where, like, so long as you get a favorable roll, right? So long as the percentages work out in your favor, you mitigate damage completely from like a weapon attack. So, getting swung at, stacking sanctuary, no damage coming through, but if you get unlucky with the rolls, or your effect fades away, which of course, you know, at the time I believe we were leaning heavily onto the Dunmeri racial, which gives you like 50 points of sanctuary, so a 50% less chance that the enemy will land like a weapon or unarmed attack against you. And it was really, really tough. It was probably the hardest fight I've ever done in an Elder Scrolls game by the numbers. And it was so ridiculous that it was kind of fun born out of its sheer ridiculousness. True enough, throughout like the Skyrim playthrough, we've had like close calls with like, oh, we have to be very careful, keep the shield up, otherwise the dragon is going to one-shot eat me, because we're playing on maximum difficulty. Especially early goings on, there were times like that. Or in Oblivion, playing on maximum difficulty, just like a couple goblins, even if you fully block their attacks, they're still going to hit through your shield and obliterate you. But getting a Revel was particularly interesting because also, not only did her damage scale up against you, right, to where it was like near impossible to survive one or more blows, even as like a really kitted out character, but the bug made it to where Gedna's own health scaled up massively too. So what I remember having to do is drinking, like sort of countering, fighting like an exploit with an exploit, fighting a bug with an exploit. What I did is, I mean, you know me, I was carrying around a gajillion potions and alcohol. So I just drank all of the alcohol at once. and the ridiculous, like the ridiculous fight, like it was so fun in the moment. It was such a fun way to go about it. I drank so much booze, I like sent my own character's strength like through the roof, to where if I landed like 2 or 3 hits with my melee weapon would be broken, because in Morrowind, the condition damage dealt to your weapon scales proportionately with the amount of damage you're dealing. And the lower the condition on your melee weapon, the less damage you deal with it as well. So I kind of had to like swap out melee weapons and all of that stuff. And of course, when you're in combat, I don't believe you can repair your weapon. So I kind of had to go through and use like less than ideal melee weapons to even defeat this character. It was very wild. It was very fun. It kind of demanded, like I said, some amount of, yeah, I think maybe that's what was cool about, because it kind of demanded some mastery to fight the bugged encounter. It demanded some sort of mastery and knowledge over the game in order to like exploit the game yourself and claim victory in for the player, right? It was super duper cool, super fun. If you're at all learned in Morrowind mechanics and all of that, it makes for a very enjoyable fight if you fight the bugged version that is just like endlessly scaled upwards. It was super cool, super fun. And I don't know, I'm glad to have done it. It's one of the, like I said, one of the more memorable little encounters. And there's zero pomp and circumstance, well, near zero pomp and circumstance about the fight itself, right? There's a little bit of build up, and it's kind of intriguing in that way. But the area in which you're fighting, not interesting. The character herself, I don't know, like nearly forgettable. The main memorable thing about her is her propensity to be like absolutely bugged beyond belief. Anyway, I think that ought to do it for this week. Bit of a longer one, I think. Yeah. Anyways, like I said as well, apologies. Bless this mess. Probably be going on for, I would like to have it all sorted by the end of the month, but like I said, it's the holidays. Probably ain't gonna happen if I had to guess. Just too dang busy. Look, I didn't even get to find, I'm lucky enough to have found a clothes iron, right? Dig that out of the packed stuff, right? Get my shirt ironed. I'm not even wearing a fun little pin today. I need to find where I put all my hats, because right now this is the only hat I've got right now, the one I wore, because it was very, very cold, actually. It still kind of is, but not nearly as much as when we were moving stuff around. But hey, I don't know. In the same way that rising to meet the challenge of Gedna Relvel, so has this been a challenge that I have enjoyed rising to meet. All right. That ought to do it for now. Until next time, please take care of each other.